In this episode of Game Art Essentials, I wanted to cover a subject known as floaters. Now, what a floater is, it's a method for handling detail that is very specific to real-time game art with normal maps. The idea is, instead of modeling in a lot of small details, instead of doing that, you would actually float these details on top, and with the end goal of when you bake your high-res model, the normal map will actually look very similar to as if you had actually modeled in all the detail. I have an example here. On the right here, this is the low poly model with the normal map applied to it, and these are two versions of the high-res model that was used to bake the normal map on the right. If we take a look at the models on the left here, you can see the two methods. This one is with the detailed modeled in. You can see that this piece is all one contiguous surface, and this disk shape is actually modeled in to the platform, so that when it's smooth, it looks like that. This one, on the other hand, is different because this disk is actually separate. It's just floating on top of the platform. I didn't actually model it in as one continuous surface. But if you smooth it, the result is actually very similar, if not identical. And when you bake your normal map, it actually looks the same. So, why use a floater? The answer is very obvious in this case. It's just, for this example in the middle here, I didn't have to model it in. It was a lot faster to make, and it was a lot easier to handle. So if I actually wanted to move this detail around, it'd be very easy to do so. Whereas over here, I could still move things around, but the geometry would start to look a little bit different here. You can see the edges get pinched a little bit more. It's just not as flexible to use, and also it's a lot more time consuming and difficult to make. In this example, it's actually not that big of a deal because it is so simple. But if you were making a more complex model, let's say the surface, the underlying surface was curved, and there was a lot more detail that had to follow the shape of the surface, and just a lot more detail in general. You would find that if you tried to model all of that in, it could be very difficult and very time consuming for sure. So now, obviously, using a floater, it's not going to always give you as good of a result. This is a very, as I said, specific to game art. You probably wouldn't be using a whole lot of floaters for high-end film modeling, for example. But because game art, all you're really concerned with is getting a good normal map. The techniques you use on the high-res modeling side, it almost doesn't really matter as long as you get a good normal map bake out of it. Because no one's ever going to see your high-res model. They're only going to be looking at the final result with the normal map. So as good as floaters are, there are going to be situations where a lot of situations where you're not going to want to use a floater. So when is a good time to use a floater? The rule of thumb that I would like to go with is basically if you think about your low poly model and how much geometry you have to work with, if the detail is something that is significant enough that you would actually model out to capture the silhouette of it on the low poly model, then that is not a good time to be using a floater. However, if it's a pretty small detail, relatively shallow, and it's not something that you're going to bother modeling out, then that could be a good candidate for using a floater. The idea of using a floater is actually pretty similar to creating normal map detail through 2D methods, such as using undo, or just painting shapes in Photoshop and converting height maps to normal map detail, and then overlaying that onto your original normal map. That kind of thing is actually very similar, because those are the kinds of details that you wouldn't bother modeling out to create a difference in the silhouette. I want to talk really briefly about the general idea about how floaters work, so that you can have a better understanding of how you can use it, and recognizing situations where it will work, where it might work, and where it probably won't work. So in our original example here, if we look at it from the side, you can see I have this detail floated on top. There's actually a gap between these two surfaces, but it's fine, because what happens is when you bake your normal map, the rays are going to be going along the normals of the surface, of the low poly surface. In this case, it's just flat, right? So all those rays are going to be going flat, and it's going to be rendering the pixels from that perspective, that flat angle perspective. And in this case, even though there's a gap here, the rays won't recognize it, because they're going perfectly perpendicular to that flat surface. And so the result is, when the normal map renders, this transition will actually be pretty smooth, because I have modeled in this little lip here. The same goes for a little bit more complicated situation, such as this, where the surface is curved. It's going to be looking at the low poly again. The rays will be going in the direction of the low poly surface here. So in this case, that would still work, even though there's a gap here between the two. It would render fine. Where it might not work so well is if you had a very irregular surface and you were trying to shape your floater onto it, and let's say it's very complicated and you weren't able to get it just right. Modeling in this little lip here for that smooth transition actually becomes a little bit of a problem, because if you don't do it perfectly, that transition might not be as smooth as you'd like it to be. And that's just kind of a limitation of working with floaters. I mean, it's not always going to be the best way for creating detail that is supposed to look like it transitions smoothly from the underlying shape to the detail. And usually, though, when you want to use a floater, that's not going to be that much of an issue. In this case here, you can see I've actually made no effort to create that transition, the lip transition. But when you look at the final result here, baked on, even though it doesn't have, I didn't model in that lip, when it renders, the way the normal map gets anti-alias and stuff, it actually doesn't look too bad, you know. These tend to be small details anyway, so the fact that it's not necessarily a smooth transition isn't a big deal breaker. Now, unless if that transition was very important to you, having a very smooth transition, then that would probably be a good reason not to use a floater and to actually try to model it in or to sculpt in that kind of detail. There are a few things to keep in mind when modeling your floater to try to get the most out of it. And the first thing is sloping the edges of some of the details. For example, here I have two high-res models on the left here, and two baked models on the right here. This high-res model corresponds to this low-poly model, and this high-res model corresponds to this low-poly model. And you can see the difference in the result here. You can see that this one is just a lot more effective. You can see the detail more clearly, and even on the sides, you can see what the shape is supposed to be from a distance. So it's just more readable. Whereas this one here, the detail is very faint here, and that is because if you look at the way the high-res model was built, the sides aren't sloped at all. So, as I was saying before, when the normal map rays come straight down from the normal of the surface, it's going to miss all of this detail, or not detail, all of this depth on the side of this shape. It doesn't matter if you had modeled this this high or even like this high. The normal map still wouldn't be able to pick it up because of that direction of the ray. So a lot of times what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to slope the surfaces a little bit more, kind of like I have here. Even if this is not how it would have been built in real life, a lot of times you're going to have to cheat things a bit to create a more effective normal map. Now again, if you're going to actually model out that shape on the low poly model, then sloping the high res becomes a lot less of a concern. But I would say that even in cases where you don't necessarily need to slope it, you might want to consider doing it anyway. For example, on the sides of the platform here, I've even sloped that, and you can see that just from a distance, your mind will kind of recognize this as a shape with more depth, more so than this, just because you can, from a distance, you can see the sides, the value differences created from the flat surface to the sides, whereas on this one, you don't really even see the sides. So at some angles, it might not be quite as effective. Again, these are all just little cheats that will make your game art more readable in the game, even if it's not necessarily true to reality. And this is another image I came up with just to illustrate the same thing here. Again, on the left you have a model with no slope sides, and on the model on the right you do have slope sides, and the difference in readability it makes. Next, I'm going to be going through a few different examples of different ways you can go about using floaters on your models. The first one I have is actually an example of a floater to show detail coming off the surface, and then another floater to show a recession within a surface. Here I have a curved surface, and then with some kind of a bolt on top and being recessed within a hole. And the way the high-res model is built is I just have these two floaters here. One is the bolt, and one is really just it's basically a circle that has been extruded in such a way to create the illusion of a recession there. And then when you bake it together, you get this kind of effect here. So I think this kind of shape here, these inset floaters, are actually pretty handy. They can create a lot of extra detail without a lot of effort. You can see, comparing these two shapes here, they're basically the same, except one doesn't have that recession and one does, and you can kind of see it's just a little bit more interesting. It makes a little bit more sense that this bolt, there was a hole drilled into this bottom shape and for the bolt to fit into, whereas this is something that's just sitting on top. It looks okay, but it's missing a little bit of that connection, that feeling of how two shapes actually come together in a meaningful and logical way. That's another thing you can keep in mind, is anytime you shove two shapes together, to think about how they're actually connected, and using inset floaters like this can actually help integrate them in ways that the user, the end the viewer might not really recognize it as something, as a cool detail. I mean, no one's going to actually point to that and say, "Oh wow, look at that! This actually fits together in a real way." But the general impression that you'll be conveying to your audience is that even if they can't recognize it, they'll be able to. Nothing will come up in their subconscious that will point to it as being weird or not. So something is not quite right about your model. It's just, everything is just going to work together in a more natural way. In the next example, I have something similar. I have more bolts again, but in this case, I have built this other shape on top to create just like an inset square along an edge. So this is really just showing how you can actually curve a floater around a shape like this, just having it go around the edge. And the way I built this was I just duplicated the faces that were on the surface, floated them up a bit, and then created the beveled edge of the recession. And a lot of times when I'm doing something like this, and I wanted to float stuff off along the normal, that's a good time to be using to transform stuff along the normal. Like, for example, I'm going to ruin this model for a second here. Say I'm going to extract. Actually, I'm going to duplicate this face. Okay. So I have this here, and now if I wanted to float it off the surface, you could just move it straight up, or you could try to eyeball it and move it. But maybe a better way to do it would be to select the components of that shape, and then go to transform component. Here I'm holding shift and right click. Transform component. It's also available under, I believe, edit mesh, or is it under mesh? I never use these windows, but it's transform component, and all that'll do is it'll transform your manipulator into something that is going along the normals of the surface of your shape. And if you had multiple faces selected, like let's say I had selected, I had a shape that was, actually let me go ahead and do that. If this whole thing was a floater, I'll just duplicate it again. And now if I go to face and go to transform component and move, you see that each face, it'll try to move them along the normals. You can see it's actually getting a little bit bigger than if I were to just have simply moved it straight up. I don't know if you can see the difference there, but that's what's happening there. Transforming component would just kind of help you offset things in a way that should be a little bit more precise, especially when you're dealing with something like floaters. In this next example, I have a cylinder with a bunch of inset details going all the way around here, and you can see that this is actually quite a deep shape, but because I know how the rays are going to be cast, or I can kind of predict how the rays are going to be cast, I'm not too worried about that depth creating any weirdness on the norm map. And you can see the result here. And you can see I'm starting to get some waviness on here along the edges, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about how to troubleshoot some of these kinds of problems when baking floaters. And here's another example. I have, again, a cylinder, and then trying to create some details that, in this case, these grooves that follow along the shape of the underlying surface. And you can see how it renders on the right here. And in this last example, it's a pretty simple one, but it just illustrates how you can layer together a few different floaters to create more complex detail. You can see that I have the platform on the bottom. I have a recession, and then a shape. Again, that disc shape is a detail going upwards. And here's the final baked result. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some of the common pitfalls you might run into when trying to bake a normal map with floaters. I will start by saying that normally you probably won't have any issues. I'd say for most characters, unless you're being super nitpicky, a lot of these kinds of problems that I'm going to talk about are not very noticeable and may not even be worth trying to fix. But there are going to be cases where they will become bothersome, and you will need to take some extra care to try to fix, especially if it's something that's going to be really noticeable on screen. And in my experience, it's usually a lot more noticeable on very like hard surface heavy mechanical machine kind of models, where any kind of deviation from something that looks very precise will very show up as a mistake much more clearly. In this first example here, you see this is the way I've built the high-res model, right? And then when I bake it, this is kind of the result I get. Now, on first impression, it doesn't look so bad. That kind of looks like what you would expect. However, if you look at it more closely, you can see that the way the normal map rendered, the sloped sides here, they are wider in the center of this square, and then towards the outside edges, they're getting narrower. And what I expect is it to look like this, right? Everything is evenly spaced, and you are able to fix it. And if you take care and you rebake it in a certain way, you can get things to look the way they should. And that has a lot to do with these columns that I've set up here, one being geometry normals and one being surface normals. Now what this is referring to is if you open up your transfer maps window, which is where you would go to bake your normal maps within Maya. At the very bottom, underneath advanced options, you'll see that there's at the very bottom there's match using, and by default it's on geometry normals, which is honestly what you're going to want to use most of the time. But in cases like this where your floater details are getting kind of skewed and misshapen, then you might want to switch to surface normals and doing another bake. And what you'll find is that a lot of these kinds of problems will go away. And again, like this, these kind of problems will exist closer towards the edge in this kind of case, like the closer to the edge of a floater gets is where the more of the distortion starts to happen. That's just because of the way the normal map is being calculated, where it's shooting rays around the surface, and once it gets close to an edge and it needs to compensate for it, and you get some kind of weirdness. I don't have a very technical explanation for that without potentially making some mistakes in how it works technically, but that's just how I like to think about it. The closer to the edge things get, the more of a possibility that there is to have these kinds of errors. And I kind of like to think of it as geometry normals being kind of like an average, like it's kind of expanding in a very predictable way, evenly all the way around. Whereas for surface normals, it's almost like, again, this might not be technically accurate, but the way I kind of think about it is like, it's like as if each of the faces were almost kind of separate, and then you transformed it. You can see it kind of keeps each face flat to the original orientation. Again, that's not the most technical explanation, but that's just how I like to think about the difference between geometry normals and surface normals. So the problem with you may be thinking, oh, well, why don't I just render everything with surface normals if that's going to fix the problem? The problem with rendering with surface normals all the time is that you will start to get some other kinds of errors. And if you look more closely, let's see. Okay, this is a good example down here. This one is rendered using geometry normals, and this one is using surface normals. The problem that you'll run into with surface normals is where the actual seams are, where the edges are, you'll start to get some problems because it's not correctly compensating for how the surface is changing along the edge. But it does a great job on the surface itself. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll kind of do a combination of the two, where I will do a pass with geometry normals, and that would be kind of like the base normal map render. And then if necessary, I'll go back and render another pass with surface normals, and then just comp the two together in Photoshop. Again, here you can see the same thing happening. The edges are getting screwed up a little bit, but the interior looks fine. Now, there are going to be some times when using this method of compositing a surface normal bake on top of a geometry normal bake isn't going to be ideal. Compositing it in itself, depending on the complexity, could take a lot of time, and it potentially, if you're not doing it right, it could even introduce some artifacts that could make things worse in some ways. So another way to approach this is to use something known as a Skew Mesh. There's a tutorial link right here, and if you want to read more about skewed normals in general, like what they are and how they happen, you can see it in this link below that. Both of these are on PolyCount, which is a great game art forum for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Not only is it a good place to see other people's work and to show off your work, it's also a very good source of technical information. I've learned a whole lot of stuff from there myself. So, it's definitely worth checking out, especially if you are newer to game art. But without stealing too much thunder from this tutorial, I'm just going to quickly summarize the general idea behind it. And the general idea is that instead of baking your normal map from your high poly model to your low poly model as you would normally, what you would do instead is you would bake the high poly model onto what they refer to as a skew mesh, or what I'm just going to refer to as kind of like an intermediate baking mesh. And what that mesh is going to be is really just a duplicate of your low poly model, except that it'll be subdivided. Now, it's going to be subdivided in a certain way. So, like, I have an example here. I have this model. Let's pretend that this is a low poly model. And if I smooth it normally, I'm going to reset the settings in the smooth options here. And if I smooth it normally, you can see that the shape of it changes quite dramatically because, this is these are the default settings. This is what you would kind of expect to happen when you smooth a model. But for a skew mesh, what you want is to add geometry without changing the shape. And there are a few different ways you can do this through these settings. What I would recommend doing is I would turn down the continuity to 0, and then I would turn on hard edges. preserve hard edges. And this is really just so that when you apply it now, you can see that not only did it add geometry, but it's also preserving wherever you had hardened normals or hardened edges, or in soft edges, it will try to keep that intact. And then what you can do is you can go in here and increase this to divisions, something like that. So now you have a model that is the same shape as the low poly model, but with a whole lot more divisions, so that when the normal map gets baked, there's just a lot more geometry there to help compensate for those changes in angles. Now what you're going to do is you're not going to bake directly to a tangent space normal map as you would normally. You would bake it to an object space normal map, which is going to look a little bit different, but the idea is you're going to take that object space normal map and then convert it to a tangent space normal map later. And the end result is that you will have, you take that final bake and apply it to your original low poly model, not this super tessellated one. And then the end result is that you'll have a very nice and clean normal map bake that doesn't have any of these kinds of skewed floater details. The problem with this method, of course, is that it is a whole lot of extra steps. Depending on how problematic these issues are, it may not be worth it to try to set this up. If it's not going to be noticeable, then I personally would not worry about it too much. But there will be times when, especially when a detail is right there in front of your face in the game, that it would be nice to know how to fix that when necessary. Now, in this tutorial, they talk about baking within 3D Studio Max and also using XNormal. I'm not much of a 3D Studio Max user myself, so I won't talk about that, but I will give my thoughts on using XNormal for this. XNormal is a fine program. It's great because it's free, and it handles a lot of geometry a lot better than Maya does, because it's not actually importing it in. The problem with using XNormal for me is that the results of the bake can sometimes not be quite as good as a Maya bake, at least in my opinion. You can see here I have two results here where you can see the XNormal bake just doesn't look like it has the kind of depth that I would be expecting. This is baked from Maya here. And just in general, my experiences with baking norm maps in Maya, the results are usually cleaner and more accurate, at least for me. But I maybe I'm just using XNormal incorrectly. But just throwing it out there in case you want to experiment for yourself, I highly recommend you do and seeing what works best for you. The last thing I want to talk about is baking other maps with floaters, specifically an AO map. The problem with the rendering AO with floaters is that because there isn't a great way to flag geometry to not cast shadow within Maya, when baking AO maps, you end up having these little shadows underneath your floaters that aren't going to be what you want for your AO map, because these floaters are supposed to really be, they're just to create an illusion of integrated shapes, right? And if you have the shadow underneath there, then it totally breaks that illusion. And so if you were going to bake it with an AO map, what you have to end up having to do is go back and erase all of these little shadows. So really, what my approach is that I keep floaters separate, and then when it comes time to bake my AO map, I just won't have the floaters on. I'll hide them or whatever, and just bake it without the floaters. And then I don't really miss floaters not having any detail in the AO map, because what I do after that is I'll create my curvature map or whatever from the cavity and the edge maps from my normal map, and then I'll use that to bring back some of that detail for those floaters. And I go over baking those kinds of things in my baking maps video. You can see the link here if you're really interested. Well, that wraps it up for floaters. Just to reiterate, they are a great way to convey small details without having to model everything. And it's a lot faster to create and a lot more flexible to work with in case you need to change something later on. If you like this video, please do like and subscribe to my channel. And if you have any ideas for other videos that you'd like me to try to teach, then please let me know. Thanks.